I really have the easiest topic today, so we're starting with the easy stuff, and then, because I get to pick on big government. So I'm going to blindfold myself now and shoot over my shoulder, and I will hit the target every time. Watch. Chesterton's argument in What's Wrong with the World is that there are four main things wrong with the world: big government, big business, feminism, and public education. And big government he calls hudge, and big business he calls gudge. Hudge and gudge. All right. So I'm going to start by talking about hudge. Good way to start the day. And we all know that the three biggest lies are, what? The checks in the mail? I promise I'll respect you in the morning. And I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. All right? Now, what is the purpose of government? In What's Wrong with the World, G.K. Chesterton says, seemingly from the dawn of man, all nations have had governments, and all nations have been ashamed of them. But he calls government a necessary evil. It's necessary because we are fallen creatures. It is necessary that we have some official mechanism of some kind to punish wrongdoing. And this is why Chesterton says government is ultimately coercion. But it's necessary. But it's precisely because government is ultimately coercion that we need to have less of it rather than more of it. Persuasion is always better than coercion. When Pope Benedict addressed the British Parliament just a week ago, he said, "This country's parliamentary tradition owes much to the national instinct for moderation, to the desire to achieve a genuine balance between the legitimate claims of government and the rights of those subject to it." Moderation. What an idea. What a neat thing to say to Parliament. I hope that he'll be able someday to come and address the joint houses of Congress with the exact same speech about the need for moderation in government. Chesterton is not an anarchist. He is not a libertarian. In fact, he even defines the libertarians as those who have an unreasonable neglect of government. And he says the danger of that is that it leads to an unreasonable neglect of everything else. So there is a role of government. And Chesterton himself believes that the best form of government is self-government, which means self-control, not just license to do anything, but to actually control yourself. And of course, this is the essence of democracy. Democracy means self-government, which means self-control. Voting, Chesterton says, means taking responsibility for what you vote for. He says both men and women ought to face more fully the things they do or cause to be done, face them or leave off doing them. Taking responsibility for our actions. But we don't take responsibility for what we vote for because we really don't take responsibility for anything. The real evil, says Chesterton, of our socialist state is not so much that nothing is being done for the people. A great deal is being done. The real evil is that nothing, literally nothing, is being done by the people. Big government is big because we don't do anything for ourselves. Chesterton argues that specialization is one of the greatest enemies of democracy. When we trust the experts for everything, we stop trusting common sense. And one of the things we forget about experts is that experts are always bought and paid for. Before we trust the expert for anything, we need to ask, who's the expert working for? Who does the expert represent? If the expert represents the government, there's always the danger that the expert is not representing the public interest and the common good, but rather the power structure that put the experts into their position that they want to preserve. That's always the danger. And that's exactly what leads to huge, gigantic bureaucracy, which, of course, is just a collection of experts, is what it is. Chesterton says that the ordinary weakness of human nature will explain all the weakness of bureaucracy. So that's how government gets to be big. And of course, the biggest problem of big government is how powerful it then gets. But Chesterton says that power is actually a sign of weakness. Size is a sign of weakness. A perfect Chesterton paradox. He says that the definition of beauty is perfect proportion. And when something is out of proportion, it's ugly. It explains so much of the ugliness of the modern world, because almost everything in the modern world is out of proportion. The wrong things are emphasized and glorified. The right things are ignored and hidden. And certainly the size of government represents a gross disproportion. I'll give you a series of Chesterton quotes here about government and about the disproportion in society. He says, our present scheme of society is a top-heavy and tottering affair. When the people does not know what it wants, the despot gets what he wants. If you will not have rules, you will have rulers. But at the same time, he reminds us, we can all love mankind if we remember not to judge them by their leaders. He says, for instance, prime ministers could never go on strike for a very simple reason: their work is not really needed. I know we all have heard Chesterton's great line that it's distressing to contemplate how few politicians are hanged. But he says that the statesman often has months to make up his mind. He has all the advantages of a good liberal education and the conversation with all the men of the world, and still he uses cant phrases. Or rather, he lets the cant phrases use him. It's a great line. And so the real decisions never seem to get made. And that's why Chesterton says that the man in power sleeps easily. He knows the commission will not report until the day of judgment, and then will recommend the appointment of another commission. He says, with us, the anarchy is worst in the governing classes because their legislation has become a sort of silly and bewildered experimentation. And in looking at America, he points out that Americans break laws too easily because they make laws too easily. And he says, we do not need good laws to restrain bad people. We have to get good people to restrain bad laws. And then he warns us that when conservatives, liberals, and socialists all agree, it is time for the larger and more harmless part of mankind to look after their pockets. A citizen can hardly distinguish between a tax and a fine, except that a fine is generally much lighter. Those were 12 different Chesterton quotes from 12 different sources. Why did I do that? Because that's what I do. Now, the bigness of big government is what makes my topic too big, too big. So what I'm going to do is focus on two particular evils. And one may seem to some as unimportant, but it is important because of its ramifications. And the other is important because it is a ramification of evil. In 1912, G.K. Chesterton wrote a novel called The Flying Inn. And in it, he imagines prohibition coming to England because, actually, of the Muslim influence in that country. But it's not an outright prohibition of alcohol. And alcohol, he points out, is an Arab word. There's beer and wine are Christian words. But as I say, the new law in his imagined scenario does not prohibit alcohol outright. It restricts alcohol to inns, and that's the only place that it can be served. And every inn, of course, has to be identified by an inn sign. But what the law does is it outlaws inn signs. Very clever. Now, Chesterton, of course, in the novel, what you have is you have these two very enterprising gentlemen who steal an inn sign and just put it up randomly throughout England, and wherever they put it up, thirsty men immediately show up. And that's the flying inn. The inn is flying around England, see. But Chesterton thought that in America, that prohibition was probably one of the stupidest things that ever happened. And while it never came to England, there was always a danger that it would. And that's why he wrote his book. But he predicted that there would be a time when the state would also prohibit tobacco and other simple enjoyments and basic rights. And he probably didn't know how prophetic the flying inn was, because in today's very frantic and urgent and anti-smoking mania, our courageous lawmakers have not banned tobacco. They've simply outlawed all the places where a person can smoke. It's like the flying inn. It's exactly the same mentality. The anti-smoking laws started with restaurants and then soon moved to bars, which is kind of insane. But the argument at that time was the dangers of secondhand smoke. In 2006, the Surgeon General Richard Carmona released a report on the effects of secondhand smoke, and he said in his press release that there are no safe levels of secondhand smoke, that even brief exposure to secondhand smoke can cause heart disease and lung cancer. And he said the debate is over. And that soundbite was repeated by the media ad nauseum. No one ever looked into the health effects of repeating that phrase. The effect that that phrase had on so many people. The one problem with the Surgeon General's press release was that the actual report did not say what he said it said. There's absolutely nothing in the report at all about brief exposure to secondhand smoke. The only evidence that secondhand smoke was problematic was in the case of, quote, chronic exposure to secondhand smoke at high levels over many, many years. That's what the report actually said. But he said any even brief exposure to it can cause lung cancer and heart disease. No scientific evidence whatsoever that that's the case. But that's what got repeated. And of course, that became the justification for all of the no smoking laws in places where people would like to probably have a smoke, like when they're having a drink. But people like to smoke and drink at the same time. It's a very Catholic thing to do. And the rather than insisting on ventilation, which is, another novel concept, we have the technology. No, there was no moderation whatsoever. The bans just started everywhere. And of course, they always started in urban areas, but then, like in Minnesota, it went in the Twin Cities, and then suddenly there needed to be a state law because they noticed that all the people in the Twin Cities were going to the bars and restaurants on the outskirts of the Twin Cities where they could still smoke. Well, the Twin Cities business owners said, well, we need a statewide smoking ban. We have to screw those other people as well. And in the suburb where I live, and of course you've all seen this, the non-smoking bans, the places where you could not smoke, quickly moved outdoors too. In the suburb where I live, it became against the law to smoke in public parks and public golf courses. The only place that, if you did want to smoke in these places, you had to go into the parking lot in your car and roll up the windows. That's actually what the law said. And why was smoking banned in these public open-air places? Because there's certainly no secondhand smoke argument. You cannot possibly make that argument. So the health argument is gone. Well, the city councilwoman who proposed the law said why she proposed it. She said, well, children might see you smoking. You see, it's a bad example. Smoking is evil. It's a sin. Okay. G.K. Chesterton said, if there's one thing worse than the modern weakening of major morals, it is the modern strengthening of minor morals. Pope Benedict, by the way, has said that the alternative to smoking is not eternal life. The anti-smoking laws are the result of Puritanism, nothing else. Chesterton calls Puritanism the righteous indignation about the wrong things. And he says, modern relativism plus Puritan individualism have produced chaos. What have the smoking bans in restaurants led to? Bans on smoking in cars, in apartments, in hotels, in backyards, even inside homes. There have been places where they've started to ban smoking inside homes. It started to happen. And this is not a ban on tobacco. Oh, no. No, because that would be prohibition, and we tried that once, and that doesn't work. And besides, we need to keep selling tobacco because it's such an important source of tax revenue. And besides, 2 out of 10 people smoke. That's 1 out of 5, okay? That's actually 60 million is what that is. And you can't just put 60 million people somewhere else. They have to go out behind the woodshed. That's where they have to go. What else has it led to? Well, you know what it's led to. It's starting to lead to bans on what you can eat, what can be served in restaurants, bans on fat, bans on sugar, bans on salt. The worship of health has replaced the worship of God, but it's not really about health. It's about controlling other people's behavior in the pursuit of mad utopian schemes. Chesterton says that cleanliness has replaced godliness, and godliness is actually an offense now. He also predicted in 1910, the same year that he wrote What's Wrong with the World, he wrote, hygiene may any day enforce the pagan habit of cremation. I was driving the other day and saw a billboard. It said, cremation, the new tradition. It's ironic that they insist on cremation when, the fumes, the smoke that comes from it, but in the same article where he says that hygiene may any day enforce the pagan habit of cremation, his very next sentence is, eugenics is already hinting at infanticide. The next adventure in the long, strange story of that sect called Christians may be to be asked once more to worship the God of government, to be told once more to offer incense to the divine Caesar. It's prophetic, but only as a metaphor, because it won't be incense that we burn, because that also causes smoke. In fact, at the same time that the reports came out about secondhand smoke, a study was published about the smoke from votive candles in churches, saying that it was worse than secondhand cigarette smoke. Obviously written by impartial observers who had no stake in this whatsoever, of course. Right away, there were churches replacing candles with little lights that you press the button, the light comes on instead, and there's your candle right there. Of course, remember now, those lights can't be incandescent light bulbs. Got to be the fluorescent light bulb there because global warming. We are being robbed of our liberties one by one. Starts with the small things, continues to everything. It starts in the public places, but be warned, it will go to the private places. It won't stop with just the public places. And Chesterton says the place of freedom is the home. That's the sacred place that has to be protected. And the greatest danger posed by big government is that it undermines the family and the place of the family, the home. It's done this in any number of ways already, certainly in the obvious form of public education, which one of our other speakers will be talking about today. Public education has replaced the authority of the family, but also in many ways the role and the functions of the family. And Chesterton said that the government had less power over a man when it could send him to be burnt at the stake than it does now when it sends him to the public school. But now we have a more serious issue, and that is that the government is trying to redefine the family. It's part of the modern culture that's really trying to redefine everything. Words get politicized, words degenerate. Chesterton says the problem is that words and meanings don't fit each other anymore. And this verbal confusion is always followed by moral confusion. And the great battle that we've just begun to fight in this country is the war over the word marriage. And when I say that we have just begun to fight it, I mean that we've actually been losing it for the last 2 generations. And we started losing this war when the laws started to allow no-fault divorce, because that started to redefine marriage and what marriage meant. Because no-fault divorce really could accurately be described as serial adultery. Chesterton writes very eloquently and extensively about divorce, and he exposes all of its dangers to society. And we've ignored those warnings, and now an even worse specter has appeared in the land. Could Chesterton have ever imagined that we would be fighting something called same-sex marriage? Yes, he could. Chesterton's references to homosexuality are very subtle, but they're very incisive, as we would expect. And as an aside, I should mention that there are some critics who have suggested that Chesterton was homosexual, or worse, that he was a repressed homosexual. The evidence that they offer is nothing. But, you can still suggest it, though. I did once read some third-hand hearsay, and it literally was that. It was a person referring to another person, to another person, to another person who said that they had heard something. What they choose to ignore is all the evidence to the contrary, particularly the evidence offered by Chesterton himself, who writes in his autobiography, "I have never indeed felt the faintest temptation to the particular madness of Oscar Wilde." So the accusers are not only accusing Chesterton of being a homosexual, but also a liar. So we'll just move on from that little bit right there. As I say, he writes about homosexuality in a very subtle way. Probably the most interesting treatment of it is in his book on St. Francis of Assisi, where he is really so subtle that most readers miss it altogether, what he's talking about. But his conclusion in that passage says it all. He says, "The moment that sex ceases to be a servant, it becomes a tyrant." And of course, he's referring to what the function of sex is. He's an early critic of birth control, which of course he says is a bad term because there's no birth, there's no control. But the purpose of sex is to make babies. Now, Chester doesn't say it quite that way. In fact, this is how he says it in another place. "We have no particular reason to suppose that a lily was intended to be beautiful. It was intended for a far nobler purpose of producing other lilies." As for marriage, Chesterton says, marriage is a fact, an actual human relation like that of motherhood, which has certain habits and loyalties, except for a few monstrous cases when it can be turned to torture or insanity or sin. Marriage is a fact, he says. It's a defined thing. You can't change its definition. You can't change the actual human relation that it represents, just like you can't change what motherhood is. And as for homosexual unions, Chesterton says, "Though a proper Noah's Ark should contain 2 specimens of every animal, nobody ever proposed that it should contain 2 Noahs." And as for anyone who supports the very idea of homosexual unions, Chesterton says, "People who hold these views are not a minority, but a monstrosity. It's simply another example of the modern and morbid weakness to sacrifice the normal to the abnormal." So we have things backwards. Homosexuality is not a sin, smoking's a sin. Homosexuality is just a lifestyle choice. I remember Father Fessio saying to me once, you talk about the restrictions on every little thing that we experience, particularly it was the smoking laws we were talking about. He said, "In California, the only thing that you're allowed to do is break the 10 Commandments." So Chesterton's attacks on divorce, on contraception, which he predicted would lead to abortion, and even his very subtle hints against any kind of normalization of perversion, all are part of his arsenal in defending the family. He says the family is the unit of the state. It is the cell that makes up the formation. It's the family that's the basic unit, not the individual. The family is what makes a society. And if we ever emphasize individual rights over family rights, it'll always undermine family rights. Because individual rights tend to recluster into special interests, whereas the family is always going to represent the good of the society as the whole. That's why you always have to protect the family as a unit and not break it up. and not call it something else or call something else it. The first things, says Chesterton, must be the very fountains of life. Love and birth and babyhood, and these are always covered fountains, flowing in the quiet courts of the home. The disintegration of rational society started with the drift from the hearth and the family, and the solution must be a drift back. Only men to whom the family is sacred will ever have any standard by which to criticize the state. And he says, if we wish to preserve the family, we must revolutionize the nation. That's from What's Wrong with the World. Now, it's not only the people who defend the family who are going to be able to stop the growth of government and the ridiculous reach of its power. It's also the people who defend the faith. Chesterton responded to the famous Marx-Lenin quote that religion is the opium of the people. He says, it's only by believing in God that we can ever criticize the government. Once abolish the God, and the government becomes the God. The fact's written all across human history, but it's written most plainly across the recent history of Russia, which was created by Lenin. There the government is the God, and all the more the God, because it proclaims aloud in accents of thunder like every other God worth worshiping, the one essential commandment, you shall have no other gods but me. Lenin, he says, fell into only a slight error. He got it the wrong way around. The truth is that irreligion is the opium of the people. Wherever the people do not believe in something beyond the world, they worship the world. But above all, they'll worship the strongest thing in the world, which of course will become government. So what do we do? What's the solution? It doesn't do any good to sit around and complain about it. Chesterton says, as long as we go on cursing the system is perfectly safe. We have to start doing things for ourselves, even if it means getting elected. A hateful thought. But we just have to start taking control and taking responsibility for ourselves. That is the essence of democracy, of self-government. And Chesterton says the human nature actually fights against that impulse. We fight against the ideal of democracy, he says, just like we fight against the ideal of chastity. Human equality, like Christianity, is a high and difficult truth, says Chesterton. So we have to start dealing with unjust laws by not respecting unjust laws. And just like these laws start with little things, we have to break the little things. We have to start some civil disobedience in regard to smoking. It's an impossible law to enforce. I can't believe that New York City, of all places, the brashest people in all the world will stand outside in lines like this. Who are these people? Who are these people dressed up as New Yorkers? Because they're obviously not. In Minnesota, when they did the statewide no smoking ban in restaurants and bars and public places, they made an exception for theater performances that you smoke on stage, because it's an artistic effect, and the arts have to be protected at all costs. Well, bars throughout Minnesota got the idea to have theater nights. Everybody's in the cast tonight. Here's your role, you're a patron. They obviously had to amend the law. But in a county in Ohio, the county where the city of Toledo is, what county is that, Ellen? Lucas County. 2 years ago, they spent $40,000 enforcing smoking laws and collected $630 in fines. How long do you think they can keep that up? Chesterton says, politicians will not make a land fit for heroes to live in. It is heroes who make a land fit for all other people to live in, even such poor little people as politicians. And of course, he always also points out the importance of local government, that's when citizens actually can get involved. And someone might say, well, okay, well, didn't all these laws start at the local level? And there's two answers to that. One is shut the hell up. But the other one is, yes, they did start at local, and it should be local decisions. It should be local decisions, but in every case, the local governments were left behind. In Greenville, South Carolina, North Carolina. I knew that. The Greenville City Council passed a rule that it'll be up to each restaurant could make its own determination whether it's a no smoking restaurant or not. Except the state said, no smoking, whole state. Sorry, Greenville, no local decisions at all. It's always a problem of the huge, big government trying to regulate everything for everybody. Chesterton made that exact same argument when he was here in 1921 talking about prohibition. He said, well, if there are people around the country who want to observe this Muslim view towards alcohol, they should be allowed to do that in their particular area. But how can you have a prohibition against alcohol in a place where they're growing vineyards like California? How can you make one law to apply to an entire country? These things should be done locally. And then, of course, we have to fight the big fights too, not just the little ones. And we do that by appealing to a higher authority than the state. Chesterton says, the more transcendental your patriotism, the more practical are your politics. By appealing to the higher authority, we can make better local and statewide and nationwide laws. But that means fighting against fashions and ideas that seem very popular, seem very strong, but Chesterton says it's the dead thing that goes with the stream. Only the living thing can go against it. We have to protect our families. We have to proclaim our faith. We have to make noise. But let's make a joyful noise. Let's not do it with anger. Let's do it with joy. Because we have the truth on our side. So we have really nothing to be angry about. And that's how you persuade people. With joy and with the truth. That's how Chesterton did it. We have to be patient, maybe, even while there is an underlying urgency. Chesterton, in writing about John Henry Newman, says that the great men of his period owed their intellectual domination to a quality greatly lacking in clever people today, and that is the great quality of patience. They knew how to convey a certain air of confidence and self-knowledge, of being untouched, of being clear of thought, and certain of victory. A dangerous patience, Chesterton calls it, because he calls it a dangerous patience, a menacing air of leisure, because it was only a prelude which led to an instantaneous and dramatic violence at the great moment when people like Newman would turn on their opponents. Chesterton had the same quality of just going easily along and suddenly swooping in with the truth, and it just takes your breath away. And that's what we have to be able to do. We have to be patient because we have the truth. but we also have to be ready to pounce with the truth. Claim the victory. We can be joyful because we have the truth on our side, but also because we have G.K. Chesterton on our side, a very happily married heterosexual cigar-smoking saint. We're going to win. Now let's go out and fight. Thank you. Thank you very much.